And Kwabena received his first 2 degrees from the University of Ghana in Legon, and he's currently a candidate for a PhD at West Virginia University, working on a dissertation called Beyond Oral Digital, Ghanaian ELIT as a paradigm for African digital textuality. And he's published in conventional print, about conventional print text in journals like Research in African Literatures, as well as on gaming culture in the Journal of Gaming and Virtual Worlds. Some of the students in my class have had the pleasure of reading his article, which, as I think they just told you, Kwabena, they found much more accessible than some of the other things I've inflicted on them. But he's also published in World of Warfare. Those of you who are real video game geeks will know what that is, yeah. And his most recent work, which is I think going to be part of his dissertation, is on flash fiction and conceptual poetry, and I think we're going to be hearing some of that now. In his talk, he plans to survey the Ghanaian e-lit space. You remember we talked in class about, I was saying how I can't find any novels about any of this stuff from Ghana. Well, duh, it's all going on online, on Facebook, which I don't participate in, so now we know. So he'd be surveying the Ghanaian e-lit space in order to process the contribution of Africa to the wider discipline of electronic literature, using video games, concrete poetry, and flash fiction. He will also ascertain the presence and use of orality in digital context to understand the relationship between oral literature and electronic literature as African literature continues to evolve. So without further ado, Kwabena, and apologies in advance for a couple of students and my colleague who are going to join us a little later.
Sure.
Thank you.
Can I start or wait for them?
Yeah, no, you go ahead and start.
Okay.
They'll come.
Okay.
Well,
thank you, Rhonda, for the wonderful introduction. And thanks to all of you two for showing up. It's not easy being here when the weather is nice in a place like this. I appreciate your being here. This public talk is basically going to be an analytical survey, as Rhonda said. I'll cover ground that relates to different genres of electronic literature, and I'll focus mainly on Ghanaian concrete poetry. And then I'll talk also about video games, because your class has looked at that a little bit. And then I'll look at conceptual poetry, and then I'll touch very briefly on flash fiction. And these are distinct genres that are examples of electronic literature, which is creative expression that relies on digital technology for creation, dissemination, and engagement. So digital technology has become a popular way through which African, and by extension, Ghanaian literary artists craft literature. And I feel like it's incumbent upon scholars to look at what is being done through research. And while such a call allows for different directions, my focus is to quote Robert Frost, the road not taken. And I'll look at examples of electronic literature and look at the relationship between them and oral tradition. And that is what this picture sort of tries to do. So I'll just define oral tradition and then move on from there. Oral tradition is a form of human communicative expression that involves the transmission, reception, and preservation of knowledge, art, and other cultural material through oral means. And now the word oral tends to be a bit controversial because it doesn't refer only to like the mouth, right? So oral tradition includes folk tales, proverbs, and work songs. But with all these examples, apart from what is spoken or sung, we need to also think about performance and gestures, because they play a significant role in understanding what is going on. And apart from these examples, physical cultural symbols are also part of oral tradition. And in this sense, the word oral has an even different definition. And I want to focus on the symbols for this talk. But to get into this, let's start with a familiar face. And it's not because she's an oral artist. So Ms. Jackson is known for quite a few things, okay? But one of the lesser known facts about her is she has a tattoo on her right arm. And this tattoo is known as Sankofa. So I'll elaborate on the term later. But for now, let's just understand that Sankofa is a Ghanaian symbol that means a return to the past. And this same symbol shows up in a sort of complementary context. And sometime before Jackson got hers, and actually in 1991, a team of construction workers in Manhattan, New York, found a cemetery for both freed and enslaved African Americans while they were excavating a building. And this area is now known as the African Burial Ground. Now, what is of interest in this talk here is, out of the about 400 remains that they found, one particular coffin spotted a motif which the New York Times called an enigmatic heart-shaped design. And upon further investigations, they found that the design is very similar to what Janet Jackson has. And as you can see, they've built this as a monument to the incident. And this is the same symbol that was on her. That is on her arm. And as African Americans, Janet Jackson and this forebear share unique racial experiences that have characterized Black America for centuries. And in these two anecdotes, the connection is symbolized by Sankofa. And of course, that doesn't mean that Sankofa is only used to remember. It's used, for instance, by the Chinese in their mass circulation of products. And they have flooded various markets, including Ghana, with cheap textiles, for instance, that tend to use Sankofa and related symbols. And the purpose of this talk isn't to look at international politics per se, but it's interesting to note that this single symbol circulates in diverse ways through complementary contexts, either as a form of identity to deliver a message or for unrelated commercial purposes. And as you can see, I'm also circulating the Sankofa symbol electronically through this presentation. Okay. And this brings us to the argument that oral tradition and digital technology are already always functioning in tandem with each other. And this informal relationship informs the basis of my subsequent argument about using oral tradition in digital creative environments. So while this symbol has been used while this symbol can be used in different ways, in this talk I propose that we look at it through the lens of concrete poetry. Now, concrete poetry is not necessarily a common means of poetic expression in African literature, or even in literature in general. A lot of people tend to not know what it is. But it's still an important aspect of poetry in that it foregrounds concerns between shape and form. And conscious experimentation with shape has a very long history in the West, for instance, where diverse examples stretching as far back to classical times all through to the 17th century, and even E.E. Cummings have seen poets try to play with form in their work. And all these examples are predecessors, and in a way they're also illustrative of concrete poetry, which is a genre that is created with the arrangement of words in a written poem intended to shift attention from the constitutive words to the general shape and form. So this genre is sort of unique when you compare it to others such as, let's say, haiku or the ballad or epic and so on and so forth, because even though sometimes the words have some meaning, it's the shape that we are supposed to focus on. So the strong link between the words and shape has enabled the genre to evolve and broaden in scope. And sometimes we even compare it to visual poetry. And this is defined by Willard Bone as poetry that is meant to be seen. In his words, where words no longer serve as a simple notational device, but as building blocks in a visual edifice. So, in other words, rather than simply represent information, the words are components of the larger shape. And the genre has a lot of traction in places like Brazil, Italy, and even in the US. But when we come to Africa, apart from the white South African Willem Boshoff, there is no real major example of a concrete poet. But then my argument here is we already have an example of this in symbols like Edinkra, and I argue that when we look at it in an electronic space, we can theorize on ways in which that can connect with digital technology and electronic literature in particular. And it's important to note that concrete poetry has been defined as sensuous objects that are meant to be perceived rather than composed in order to attract the spectator's attention to its component parts. So while the sensuous aspect of the poem cannot be stressed enough, the choice to focus on perception rather than composition privileges the results over the process in interpreting the work in question. But my argument is that the component parts are still quite important. And when I do an analysis moving forward, I'll show you why I think this is so. But one of the things we can think about in this argument is that then performance comes into play. And since this is so important in oral tradition, we can then think about Edinkra in this way. So with these thoughts in mind, I'll return to Sankofa, which is a member of the Edinkra family. And Sankofa is used to represent, in this talk, the potential of Edinkra to influence the evolution of concrete poetry within an African elite space. And I would just like to explain that a little bit further so that you understand what, or where Sankofa is coming from. So the Akan ethnic group, which populates the coast of West Africa, mainly concentrated between present-day Ivory Coast and western to central Ghana, is said to own Edinkra symbols. And like most examples of oral literature, which typically do not have an identified author and are therefore communally owned, it's unclear when these were created, but research tells us that they are a couple of centuries old. And these symbols represent concepts, proverbs, or general philosophies of life, and were initially the preserve of traditional rulers who used them to signify their power and position of honor. Today, their use is more widespread and democratic. And as you can see, this is the logo of a company in Ghana, and this Edinkra symbol means creativity. And as creative as they were, they just called their thing. And sometimes it is used in clothing, and it can also be used as a way to deliver messages. So for instance, when I was marrying my wife, I had the Edinkra symbol that talks about marriage, you know, and she got it in. We are where we are right now. Anyway, so, but then it's important to also note that even though they have fixed meanings, they can be used in all kinds of ways. And the example I have with the Chinese, for instance, shows that. And these are more examples that are also used in, even though they can be used in specific contexts, it's not always so. I mean, sometimes one can be used to indicate mourning, but someone can wear it to a party and people might not know it. And so on and so forth. But I'd like to focus on Sankofa. And Sankofa literally means go back and take it. And it connects closely with the Akan proverb that says, Se urefura, a Sankofa yeche. In other words, if you forget something and you go for it, it's not a bad thing. And unlike most Edinkra symbols that have one designated symbol, Sankofa has two major variations. And this is the first one, which is part of the Edinkra symbol that were created. While this one comes from a folk tale. And this one, sometimes it has the egg on the back, sometimes it doesn't. But either way, you have a bird with with a very long neck that turns behind itself onto its back. And it's important whether the egg is there or not, as I'll explain moving forward. But the fact that there's a folk tale shows that there's a strong connection to storytelling, and I'll tell the folk tale very, very briefly. I won't tell it in the traditional sense because we don't have too much time. But yeah, because typically, if I was to do that, if I was telling the story, if let's say he knew the story, if I was saying it and it was a bit boring, he could get up and say, "You are lying," and then you take over and say it in a more interesting way. Or let's say I'm saying it and then someone is maybe dozing off. Someone could just get up and sing. Everyone was singing along, and someone would take over as well. But of course, we don't have time, so I'll just tell you the template story. So there is this bird which is young, immature, and lives in a village with all these other people. It's a very nice village. Things are very, very nice and happy there. And one day she decides to leave and go to the nearby forest. There's always a forest in these stories. And when she goes, she doesn't tell anyone. And this is a problem because when you are in a community as hers is, you need to let people know what you are doing. And that is something that nowadays people get into people's business. But in the past, it was very fine to let people know what you're doing all the time. So she goes surreptitiously and she meets this predator that starts to ask her questions and intimidate her. And she flounders, she isn't able to deal with it, and she loses her confidence. And she returns to the village very shaken. So she returns at a time when everybody is out. It's like rush hour time, right? And then when they see her, they ask her what is wrong, and she tells them, and they berate her for not telling them, or for not informing them that she went out. So after a while, she decides to go out again, and this time she tells everyone. And when she goes out, she meets the same predator, and this time she's able to, stand up to it. So when she returns, they're happy with her, and they build a statue of her with a longer neck, with the egg, to let people know that you need to, it is fine to go back to your past or to do something that you haven't done well in order to progress as a person or whatever, okay? And due to the fact that this symbol represents a story, my argument is that Sankofa roots itself in literary context. And I would say that the original Sankofa symbol and the different adaptations of the Sankofa bird, because sometimes the bird can face the other way, and like sometimes there's an egg, there isn't an egg, just because artists have that creative license to do all of that. They are both designations of the same idea of a return. And that's like a typical signifier. The relationship between the sign and the reference can be arbitrary or even tenuous. And this researcher called Claudia Osampa makes a distinction between signs and symbols and argues that unlike signs, which usually stand for a tangible idea, symbols typically represent something less palpable than the representation itself. In the case of Sankofa, the overriding use of the curve to represent the notion of return is a helpful way of complicating or questioning this arbitrariness, because the idea of going back can be easily represented by a curve, right? So, but then as to whether this is a symbol or not, sometimes there's controversy about it. There is this other scholar called Christine Temple who argues that these are not symbols because a symbol is a very Western way of sort of downplaying the importance of these motifs. But for the purpose of this talk, I just call it a symbol. And the representations here, like I said, offer the idea of analysis. So I'll just attempt briefly analysis of the two, just to show how they can function in concrete poetry. So the notion of return, like I said, is meant to be seen in the curves. And when you look at this closely, you can see that there are 6 curves, which are represented in 3 pairs. 2 on the outer edges of the symbol, 2 within the space created by the outer curves, and the final 2 at the bottom, curving outward. And the constituents of each pair mirror each other and thereby imply symmetry, balance, and uniformity, not just in terms of the visual, but also with respect to the ensuing message. Then this notion of balance is supported by the appearance of a stand at the bottom of the image, which completes the symbol by providing a foundation. And due to this overbedding of curves, one gets the impression that there's a consistent message which is then told in different ways. The uniformity in diversity is accordingly enhanced by repetition. Having 3 complementary pairs of 6 curves suggests an anxiety of disburdening the message of a return, as is the case with having curves at the top, within, and bottom of the image. All of these choices underline the necessity with which one must return to history in order to move forward. Furthermore, the fact that the symbol is not a perfect circle tells its viewer that the return is neither straightforward nor meant to be for the simple sake of a return. So going back, in other words, should glean the positive of the past, which is intended to enrich progress into the future. And now, the Sankofa bird, for me, leads to even wider possibilities if examined as concrete poetry, due to it being a symbol from a narrative. Narrative is an aspect of concrete poetry that is usually not taken into consideration during analysis of examples of the genre. So Brian J. McAllister, for instance, notes in an article that narrative is not necessarily important. And he traces this tendency to practitioners of concrete poetry, such as the De Campos brothers and Carlo Bellolo, all of whom explicitly disown the presence or utility of narrative in their work. But in his article, he manages to undercut poetic intention by going to great lengths to try and find some meaning in concrete poetry. But in the end, he admits that it's a difficult thing to do. And I think that with these, it's even easier to find narrative. And the textual relationship embodied in concrete poetry creates the ability to translate ideas into visual images. And by extension, the relationship between the idea and image with respect to Sankofa foregrounds the importance of the symbol as text. On the surface then, Adinkra symbols and concrete poetry share a relationship due to typography. And when we analyze the image, the presence or absence of the egg on the bird's back leads to different interpretations. In Akan tradition, the egg signifies the delicateness of power. Recalling an Akan proverb which, when translated, says that power is as fragile as an egg. If you hold it tightly, or if you hold it loosely, you risk breaking it. And Paul Banahini Ejay explains that the sacredness of eggs in traditional Akan custom informs its use in important rituals, such as festivals. And positioning the egg as the bird's target therefore underlines the importance of history as a powerful and influential construct. In basic terms, history becomes power, and the person who controls history is therefore in a strong position to benefit from the power relations. In addition to contextual knowledge, there are possible interpretations as well. In literal terms, for instance, the egg could represent the bird's offspring, and as such, maybe the bird is reaching out to its child to teach it. And that brings out an intergenerational idea, where maybe the unborn generation or the younger generation is without the experience to understand certain things. So the older generation has that responsibility to reach out to them and engage with them in a sensible manner. Okay. And for me, I argue that when we look at these in an electronic context, they then help us to think about different ways in which we can look at concrete poetry. And I'll pivot quickly to talk about video games and then move on to conceptual poetry, just so we can look at different examples here. Typically, we don't think about video games as literature, but I think we should, because they share important features with conventional literature, such as plot, character, setting, conflict, context, and audience engagement. And I just wanted us to look very, very briefly at two games here, Anansi the Origin and Oware 3D. And they both use oral tradition in ways that complement each other, I believe. And while Oware 3D is inspired by an actual board game, Anansi comes from a folk tale. And Anansi is, Oware 3D is created as a result of its namesake, Oware, which is a game very similar to Mancala and other types of pet and pebble games played around the world. And as I was having a conversation earlier, even in Ghana, there are different ways of playing the game. Depending on where you are, you play differently. So if you meet someone from somewhere else, it's like having like different rules for the same game. So unless you argue with the person and win your argument, you might lose because you didn't know how to play. Anyway, the name itself is translated from Twi into English as he or she marries. And it's explained as such. In the story, a husband and wife are sort of tired of each other and they want to divorce. And one of them comes up with the idea that, well, let's just play this game one more time and afterward, you go your way. And when they start, the game is so addictive, they keep on playing, they keep on playing, keep on playing. Then after like, you know, days, they're like, well, let's just give this another chance. And they live happily ever after. And this, I mean, this can remind you of the Tales from 1001 Nights if you've read that, because there someone is about to be killed, but then she tells the king that, you know, let me just tell you one story, which leads to 1,000 stories, and then she saves her life. So whether it's marriage or death, I mean, marriage and death are two different things, we hope at least. And even though they are different entities, the connection between narrative and entertainment underlines the importance of the social and cultural exchange. And thus, audience is a very integral part of any discussion with games like this. And we can also think about gender as well, and I'll talk briefly about that moving forward. But the social aspect of Oware is one of the driving forces behind the creation of the game on the mobile phone. And in an interview, the game maker said he wanted to make a different experience that would be authentic for his intended audience. And he took different creative risks in order to achieve this. One of this includes like using default African names. So as you can see, there's Anansi there. He didn't want to use like Western names because he felt that would sort of alienate his audience. And sometimes these choices might appear cosmetic, but Kofi Anyidoho argues that a major Ghanaian writer like Aye Priyama intentionally uses Ghanaian names and African names not only to possess symbolic value, but to frequently serve as keys to the cultural and social identity of characters. So for Ama, for instance, the loss or retention of a true African consciousness and identity is often indicated by the name his character bears. So when we think about the use of Kwaku Anansi is the major character of folktales, and I'll talk about him when I talk about the second game. But he's known for his tricks. So essentially what the game maker is saying is if you use him or you play against him, you are playing against someone who is very skilled. So in other words, if you are also on that level, he's saying something nice about you, at least on that level. And the use of Ghanaian names thus foregrounds authenticity and identity by adding local coloring through the naming. And the other name in this is Okonoria, who is Anansi's wife. And that harkens to the way in which the game itself was created, or how the game was named. Okay. And even though sometimes people argue that the wife in Anansi stories has not as much agency as Anansi, having the two of them as equal game, as equal competitors, says something about agency and gender. And another way that the writer or the game maker tries to work against some of these cultural problems is the predominant use of blackness. And I was having a conversation earlier on about the importance of things like this. And this decision, for me, it speaks to David Dietrich's argument in an article where he says that forcing an Anglo-Western appearance of avatars that purport to represent difference among players risks reinforcing the sense of normative whiteness as well as shaping the social composition of online worlds into all-white virtual spaces. So of course, gamers are a cosmopolitan mix, and having alternatives like this help with identity politics for me. And I'll just move quickly to the other game, which is also from a folktale. And actually, this is sort of the original folktale, which is about how Anansi got to own stories, and that's where the title Anansi, the origin, comes from. So in the story itself, Kwaku Anansi lives in this place where all stories are known as God's stories. And God says, like, one day, he says, well, I could let someone have stories named after the person if they want to. And in order to do this, he has 4 tasks which he puts up. And he says, you need to capture a leopard, capture bees, capture a dwarf, and then capture a python. And of course, no one is foolish enough to try that because you just die for no reason. But Anansi is very proud, very vain, and very intelligent. So he says, well, I'll try it. So what he does is he uses his intelligence and his firstborn son to try and get this done. So what he does is he goes to goes to the house of a leopard and starts to argue with his child. And they both argue about whether the leopard can fit into this huge sack or not. So they argue very loudly, and then the leopard comes out and says, you guys, I'm trying to have my siesta, just shut up else I'll kill both of you. And I says like, well, you know, I know you could kill us, but let me just prove to my foolish son that, you know, I'm right. So just, you know, prove to him that you can fit into this. Of course, he goes and then Anansi ties it. Then he has this long pole. He also goes to where the python lives, and then he says, Well, I would just like to measure this. So could you just stretch yourself next to it? The dumb animal does it, and then he ties it quickly. Then he pours water on where bees live, and then he holds this pot and says, just get into this and then avoid the water. They get in and then he ties it. Then with the dwarf too, he just finds a very sticky tar-like thing and puts it there. And then he puts some food that the dwarf likes by it. When it gets to the food, it gets stuck on it. And that's where the tar baby story comes from in the Brer Rabbit African-American tales. But anyway, he does these 4 things, and God is so impressed that he names stories after Kweku Anansi. So in local Ghanaian terms, stories are called Anansi-san. Okay, and that's where it comes from. So the question then is, how does the game maker change this into a game? And what he does is to create 4 tasks, just based very, very similarly on the story itself, where the gamer is supposed to capture these 4 at the end of each adventure, as it were. And as you progress, you do the same things that Anansi did, but of course, in this case, it's a very sort of regular, like 2-dimensional game. And but I will not go into the story itself per se, but I'll just say that assuming control in the game is in a way read as a story of the colonized, because then when you win, you get to name things according to your own whims and caprices, and not according to ways in which others have named you. And the transformation from story to game recalls other adaptations of Anansi, and there are multiple ones in there. And as an example of the adventure genre, the game is characterized by a teleological linearity, which is absent from the template story. Because like I said before, a template story can move in all kinds of directions depending on the way that the person who is telling it wants to tell it. And in its conversion to digital environments, both games try to retain as much fidelity to oral tradition in varying ways. Ultimately, they are looking at a very interesting way of combining what is old with what is new. And for me, I don't want to argue that one does a better job than the other. I just argue that they are doing it in different ways. So this is one of the in-game shots. And when you capture one of the bosses in the game, this is how it looks like. So I'll talk briefly about conceptual poetry, then I'll touch very, very briefly on flash fiction, and then I'll be done, so bear with me here. Conceptual poetry is a form of literature that is also very unknown on the African literary landscape. It's defined as uncreative writing. And what happens with this genre is the conceptual artist just picks a lot of different data and puts it together in a creative sense. One example is Night Moves by Stephanie Barber. And what she did there was she picked YouTube comments on a song called Night Moves, and she just put it together. So when you read it, it's like you are just looking at ways in which different users have spoken about the same thing, okay? And it's defined as non-expressive poetry in which substitution that relates to the use of metaphor are replaced by the direct representation of language itself. And the practitioners who include these people argue that you don't really read the work as you would a traditional like piece of literature. And this is an example from a conceptual poetry piece. As you can see, this doesn't really make sense, so I wouldn't even read it because it's a bit, it doesn't make sense, basically. And but there are no examples of this in Africa, or there haven't been, or there weren't until 2013 when Nana Aredamoah came up with my book of GH quotes. And what he did was to start this movement. He started by by putting this on Facebook. He said, never introduce your child to the delights of the tilapia head until he or she is old enough to buy for himself or herself. Wow. Yeah, exactly. He went there, and people found it interesting and funny, and then they started writing their own examples, and it went a bit viral because he has a huge following on Facebook, and almost anything he does, like, leads to this movement of sorts. And so we had all kinds of examples, which he put into a Facebook quote. I mean, a Facebook note, sorry. And then from there, he came up with this, My Book of Cheese quotes, which is an example of conceptual poetry because he's simply taking people's quotes and mashing them up together. And this, even though it's a very easy and simple thing to do, people haven't done it in African literary context, which I found interesting. So there are some examples here. Yeah. He said, and there are like many of these. And so what they would do typically, yeah, I know, they're talking, not just so.
That's awesome.
Yeah. And actually the book is free and it is on, it's online. You can find it and read it and you can use it for whatever you want to.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think Trump would feature in the next volume. Yeah. And I divided them into different examples just because like there were different ways in which people tried to sort of appropriate creativity. And one of the things that I thought was important after all of this was that we could think about this in terms of satire, but we could also think about it in terms of post-colonial rewriting of agency and wisdom of primarily Western authors and similar figures of authority. Because you would have like a very like a well-known person like maybe Obama or Berlusconi or somebody talk about something going on in Ghana, and you know that isn't really happening. So, and theoretically, there was this bridge of access in terms of power relations because we had all these sort of unknown Facebook users who were sort of accessing these people in power in very humorous ways. And of course, Damois was very clear about the question of ownership and creativity. He, in an interview with me, he said he didn't want to be seen as the person who was sort of creating anything. He was just the, like the gatekeeper of sorts, which of course he's editing in that sense, but he tries to be as understated as possible. And he gave this disclaimer at the end just to let you know that it's all jokes and it's all fun, even though there was a lot of biting criticism as well, you know. So this is another example. Yeah. And finally, this is just how I'm wrapping up. I wanted us to look very briefly at flash fiction, which is also gaining traction in Ghana. And on the websites, you have different examples of very, very short like flash fiction pieces, mainly 500 words and nothing more. And the genres that they are using are sort of avant-garde, at least in Ghanaian context. For instance, science fiction is not very well known in Ghana, at least. I know that Nigeria there is some of it, and your professor will be teaching Lagoon, for instance, and so on and so forth. And one of the things I'm doing moving forward is looking at the theme of illicit relationships, because I've looked at that before. And one of the examples is this. I won't go into it, but okay, I'll just summarize it. So there's this young girl who is in like high school. Yeah, I know. She is daydreaming in her class about sleeping with her neighbor's husband. And as she does this, her teacher comes forward and sees her like writing a poem about it and sends it to the school principal to deal with her. And there are other examples as well. There's one called Red Means Stop, where a husband, wife, and daughter are all thinking about sleeping with someone else. So the husband frequents this brothel, and he has lied to his family that he's going to work late into the night, and he's going there. the wife is on Skype with this man in a different on a different continent, and she thinks, well, nothing has happened, so it's fine. And the daughter has been working as a call girl for this woman. And the story ends with the father entering this brothel only to meet his daughter. And the writer uses red as a sort of a controlling motif of sorts. Very, very interesting work. And there are so many examples of it going on that I recommend you check it out. The website is called Flash Fiction Ghana. You'll see a lot of good stuff there. Just in terms of concluding, because we've been here for a while, and thank you for your time. These genres are just a few examples of ways in which creative artists can and are working with digital technology in Ghana. But what is the point, however, of engaging with these examples through the lens of oral tradition, for instance? For me, oral tradition is important in ways in African literature that differ from other regions, such as European or conventional American literature. As such, to root a new media practice in old media helps us to bridge a temporal gap while enabling a smooth transition across different technological spaces. Because oral tradition is a form of technology, if you think about it. And in engaging with these examples, it's also important to note that the use of traditional African forms adds a unique flavor to the finished product, and by extension, enriches the genres on a more global level. Such issues are important because even though creative artists are making strides in African literature, scholarship has not been as quick to catch up. So as research processes these examples, we will be able to define the discipline in clear terms to include various features of African literature in order to examine the ways in which this uniqueness can extend our understanding of the digital in general. Thank you very much.